All right.
All right. Well, Dan, I'm going to go ahead and we've only got one poll question, but we're right at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get going on that. So hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us for our 3-hour webinar today. So we enjoy doing these 3-hour ones. We know that a lot of you are busy, so if you can't join us for the whole thing, no big deal. As we were just talking about, we're going to record it, and you'll receive an email tomorrow with the link to the recording. We'll also probably do some breaks on the hour just to let everybody get up and stretch and get a snack or whatever. So on that, let me go ahead and launch our poll question. We just want to know where you are in your DBA journey. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to answer that.
Let's see where. And like I said, Liz, this could be a fun morning for us all watching me work through. Work through. Oh wow. Good. Just starting out, beginners, intermediate. So this is good, and then we have quite a few experts in here as well. So.
Well, it's the story of a DBA a lot, you know, always working through issues and trying to get things up and running.
Yep.
That's you start off with a good DBA fundamental.
Yeah, it's so, and we'll talk about that as we go, as we start the slide deck here. What I'm going to be covering in the expectations, because and I want to be upfront and honest. You know, this class may be, I may share some things that the experts don't know, but with 12% of the experts out there and even the intermediates, you know, I may be covering a lot of the fundamentals, you know, but this is gonna be a good place for us to reach out and talk to each other, and then also I can be available for questions via email after the webinar. Also, the slide deck that I will be presenting today will be presented to everyone. Liz, if we could send that out, I'll make it available to everyone so that they don't need to take a lot of, you know, slide notes. They can take their own notes, but that way they don't have to worry about taking pictures of the slides. So.
Yep, absolutely. We can put a link to it in the email that goes out tomorrow to everyone.
Excellent. And I don't think anybody's seeing my screen yet, so.
Nope, not yet. I haven't made you presenter,
okay.
But there is the poll results on your screen. I think everybody's had a chance to look at them, so I'm going to go ahead and hide it and give Dan the floor to go ahead and get everything started.
Excellent. And show my screen. And which screen are you seeing right now?
I see the PowerPoint editor right now.
Oops, okay, I need to change the screen. All right. There we go. You should see a big blue Windows sign at this point.
Yes.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. My name's Dan Taylor, and we're going to be doing a DBA Fundamentals Takeover. Devin and Liz asked me, you know, hey, Dan, would you be willing to do a takeover the beginning of December? And I said, what a better way to give people a holiday gift than boring them with what I think the fundamentals are. So here we are this morning. This is a great place for us to be, and a great place for us to discuss a lot of these items. My name's Daniel Taylor. I'm a lead consultant at Pragmatic Works. I've been here for about 1.5 years now. That's some of my credentials there. I worked at Nielsen Media Research, Publix, and New York Life Direct in the past. There's my Twitter account at DBA Bulldog, and I blog. I need to get better at blogging, but I do blog at WordPress.dbabulldog.com. I also blog internally for our website as well. Just real quick, I wanted to show this slide. This will be shown throughout the webinar. Right now, for the month of December, it expires December 13th. We're providing a 20% discount on the DBA Fundamentals On Demand training by typing in the DBA webinar. The DBA Fundamentals is going to go into more detail of what we're covering today and go more into the demos and have labs for a lot of items we're going to discuss. So it's a great class. A lot of folks, about 5 or 6 folks from our team, put together that class, and then we recorded it for our on-demand training. So we're going to take a 3-hour tour today, and the 3-hour tour, here you can see the skipper. I love Gilligan's Island growing up, and I always thought that they did what they could with what they had, because a lot of them had the fundamentals. What we won't be doing today, and I put this in here, is an engine exploded view. SQL Server has a lot of components. It has head gaskets, it has oil filters, it has water pumps, it has the oil pan. We're not going to be going into those details today. What we're going to be looking at is we're going to just look at the engine itself. We're going to open up our hood, make sure it's nice and shiny, look at the belts, and make sure that the pieces we need there for it to function properly are working. So I wanted to level set. We're not going to go into the internals. A lot of the stuff that we're going to cover is probably going to be 100 to 200 level material. If people are familiar with the slide, the rating we use for SQL Saturdays and that. We're not going to get real in-depth here. So I wanted to share that up front. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at, during our 3-hour tour here, we're going to look at things like our installation options, what we'll do during our post-install, hardware and virtualization considerations, on-premise and in the cloud. We're getting a lot of questions at Pragmatic Works of how do we move things to the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about SQL Server and database security, backup and restore. We're going to look at our management tools provided to us. We're going to just take a quick look at querying SQL Server, and we're going to discuss high availability and disaster recovery basics, and we're going to look at maintaining SQL Server and maintenance plans, understanding our SQL Server agent, our baselines, our extended events, and we're going to look at some basic troubleshooting as well. And if time permits, I'd like to discuss a little bit what I think a database administrator should know from a business intelligence administration, because we're getting a lot of those questions when we walk in the shops today, and we can't. As a database administrator, we just can't focus on the engine anymore. We got to be able to support our dev teams. And with the stack growing and becoming more popular within our environment, we need to know how to look at it and troubleshoot it. So as you can see, there's a lot to cover there. I hope we can cover this all in the 3-hour tour. Like I said, if we don't, we will have the slide decks. I'm always available via email. So let's first look at our SQL Server installation options. We have our standalone instances, we have our failover cluster instances, and then we may have some things we want to consider before we install. We have several editions. We have our Enterprise, our Business Intelligence, our Standard, and our Express edition. The most common editions I run into out there are Standard and Enterprise. I do see Express Edition used a lot by vendor apps, but in most cases you're going to be installing your Standard or Enterprise. How are we going to choose what we need to use? Well, it's going to depend on our processing needs. Do we need the Enterprise Edition features? And most importantly, what does our budget allow for? So with respect to our processing needs, you can see here that our Standard Edition, for example, will allow us to go up to 28 cores, and that I believe went up to 24 cores recently, so I need to update the slide deck there. 128 gig of memory, but we can look over at our Enterprise Edition, and basically we're not limited by our cores or our memory necessarily, because it's set to the OS max. So that's what you want to keep in mind when installing your Enterprise versus Standard Edition. Why we want to keep that in mind is because of this right here, because of our cost. Now these are out of the box costs, and I'm hoping that we're not all using the retail cost. Some of us are, and I've run into shops where when they purchase SQL Server, they have the retail cost. They're just not a big enough shop to be able to negotiate down the price. But here you can see that if we were to utilize the retail price for Standard Edition, it would be slightly over $3,000. If we were to utilize if we were to look at our cost for Enterprise Edition, you're looking at about slightly over $14,000 a core. So if we don't need these items, if we don't need advanced security, if we don't need data warehousing, if we don't need advanced high availability or advanced transaction processing, is it really worth the time to, is it really worth our business, is it really worth putting our budget into something like $14,000? Let me rephrase that there. Is it really worth paying $14,000 here for our enterprise edition, or do we want to save the money and put it someplace else like monitoring tools and get $3,000 per core? So it's something we need to keep in mind. And you can if you do the math, if you have a virtual machine with just say 4 cores, you're going to be spending $12,000, around slightly over, well, let's say close to $16,000 or slightly close to $48,000. I would like to save the money if I could. When we're setting up our standalone installation, we have some recommendations when we walk into a shop. We like to have SQL Server accounts to run our SQL Server database engine and our SQL Server agent service. We like to have these set up ahead of time. So if you can work with your security team to get those up and running, get them created within your Windows Active Directory Hive and have those available prior to your install. Have your ISOs and service packs and cumulative updates stored in a central location. A lot of times I will walk into a shop and we will be in a critical situation and we'll have to wait for an hour for the downloads to finish. Standardize your drive layout, standardize your database engine install, and standardize your post-installation scripts. That's very important to have having an environment that's easy to troubleshoot and walk through when you're having performance issues or when you have an outage due to a drive going bad. Knowing that you have a standardized environment, it means that if I run into a problem on server A, if I go and look at a problem on server C, I'm looking in the same places for that issue. We have our failover cluster instances, and we're going to talk about that up front here. We're not going to talk about availability groups here. We're going to talk about those a little bit later. But we have our failover cluster instances. We're going to talk here briefly about the considerations when building an instance. We're going to look at a bird's eye view, what it does and doesn't do, and why we would use a failover cluster instance. So when we're considering a clustered instance, and this is most important, a good friend of mine out there in the industry, he really hammered this home. And do you have an experienced staff to implement? If your question is no, or if your answer to that question is no, then the failover cluster instance may not be quite for you right now. What you'll want to do is you want to get your staff trained to be able to support that. There's nothing more frustrating than troubleshooting issues with a failover cluster instance when you don't have an experienced staff, because you're kind of shooting in the dark. Do you have a solid infrastructure to support your failover cluster? A solid network, a solid virtual environment. You got to make sure those are stable before you implement a failover cluster instance. If those aren't stable, you're going to have a lot of failovers. Does the cost of a long-range outage exceed the cost of failover cluster instance? If I know I can restore my databases very quickly and that the business can take the outage, then maybe failover clustering is not for us. The failover cluster instance provides us protection against hardware or OS level failures. It's important to point that out. And it doesn't protect us at a data level. We still need to do our backups and our database consistency checks. We always need to do those, but we need those. Those are more important when using a failover cluster instance. Bird's eye view, a failover cluster consists of nodes that can be active or passive. Our nodes are set up using and configured using our Windows Server failover cluster. Our failover cluster instance is built on top of that. The WSC, you'll hear it commonly referred to as our Windows Server failover cluster. A SQL Server instance resides on each node in the cluster. I'm sorry, the SQL Server instance resides on a node in the cluster because there's only one active node at a time. The node within the running SQL instance is considered, you'll hear a lot of people call that active. And each failover cluster instance has a set of shared disks. So if your disks are on node 1 today and it fails over to node 2, those disks via the Windows Server failover cluster and the failover cluster instance will move to your node B. What it does and doesn't do, it does provide us reduced downtime when patching, so we can patch one node, fail over, the failover is brief, and then we can patch the other node. It does reduce our unplanned downtime due to hardware or software failures. It doesn't reduce our downtime to 0. It doesn't provide us with load balancing, and it doesn't, once again, provide our data projection. And I want to go back up a little bit there. It doesn't reduce downtime to 0. And this is sometimes the hardest thing to sell when we're selling failover cluster instances, is that a lot of folks believe that when it's failing over from node 1 to node 2, the database servers are still active. They are not. There could be a brief blip in time, or it could take longer if you've got a lot of transactions playing when the failover happens. So just keep in mind that your downtime is not reduced to 0 when using failover cluster instances. Once again, I want to drive home, we want to use a failover cluster instance when we have an experienced team, when the cost of an extended outage is greater than cost of implementing a failover cluster instance, and we have good we have solid and redundant storage. When we walk into, or when I go in and we do a health check of the systems, when we go in, some of the things we first look at is what post-installation configurations have been done in the environment. So I like to recommend that these be set up ahead of time before you make them live to your end users. So let's walk through these a little bit. Within our post-installation configuration, we have our SQL Server Configuration Manager. We can use this to manage our SQL services. We manage our accounts used by our services, and we manage our server and client network protocols. The reason I mentioned the SQL Server Configuration Manager is because inside here is where we can input some of our startup parameters. For example, if we have trace flags, and we're going to go over that in a little bit here, but if we have a trace flag that we want to run every time we start up the SQL Server instance, we would put it within, we would use our SQL Server Configuration Manager to put that parameter inside the service, the SQL Server service. Also, with the SQL Server Configuration Manager, we can start, stop, and pause and restart our services. We can also use this to manage our server and client network protocols. It allows us to create or remove aliases. You see there's a client protocol alias. That is very similar to a CNAME. So if you don't want to use CNAME and you want to set up an alias for your SQL Server instance for folks to connect to, you can set it here. And it allows us for viewing information about our failover cluster instances as well. So let's look at that real quick. We covered a lot of stuff, so let's take a break from our slide deck and let me go over here to our SQL Server instance here. I have a client machine, a VM set up for SQL 2016 HA Node 1. And over here, let's reduce that. I'm going to open up my window, and over here you can type in SQL Server Configuration Server. No, I need to learn how to spell, folks. SQL Server 2016 Configuration Manager. Let's open that up. We'll give it control. And here you can see the same items that we saw on the other screen there. We can see that we have our SQL Server services, and you can see here that I have SQL Server, my standard edition. I have my enterprise edition also running here. We can see the accounts that they're running as. Right now I have a single account running these. If I have multiple accounts, 80 accounts, you would see the different accounts here. Here you have your SQL Server network configuration. One of the things that we see most often when folks talk to it or reach out to us is they can't connect remotely to the SQL Server instance. And a lot of times we'll see this here, that the TCP IP, and let me do something real quick here, folks. I apologize, I should have had that running here. You'll see here that we have our TCP IP setting. What we'll see a lot of times is this here, this item here will be disabled. So if you can't connect remotely to your SQL Server instance, you may want, or your users can't connect remotely, you may want to come in here and you may want to see if your TCP IP setting is disabled for the protocols for SQL Server. Also here, if you wanted to set up that alias, this is where you would do that for underneath your SQL native client configuration. You could do an alias, right mouse click, and you could do a new alias. And you would give a proper alias name, and then folks could connect to your SQL Server instance using that alias. So that is the configuration manager, SQL Server configuration manager. Let's go back to our slide deck. And let's talk about trace flags real quick. We have two trace flags within our environments. We have our session and we have our global trace flags. Our session trace flags are just that. They're good for the session that we initiate them for. We have our global. The global ones are set at the server level and visible to everyone. So if you set up a trace flag and we say DBC trace on, and we set it up just as a session level without a common -1, you're the only one that'll see that. If we put a common and -1, everybody will see it. We'll be able to utilize and see that trace flag. So let's pop back over here. Let's look at our server. So we have our server, and I have my server configuration manager. All right, open. Let's go here real quick. So within our SQL Server instance, our SQL 2016 HA Node 1, we're going to run a command called dbcc trace status. Oh, if I could type. Okay. Right now, this is showing no information. If, for example, I turned on trace on, and this is how you would turn a trace on here. You would turn your trace on by doing dbcc trace on, and let's turn on trace flag 3226. And what 3226 does is, and this is one of our recommendations, is it stops the logging of backups to your error log file. So if you're seeing a lot of error log, or if you're doing a lot of backups on your database server, it's good to turn that trace flag on. They won't go to your error log and flood your error log. So if we run dbcc trace status again, now what you're going to see is that our dbcc is showing here within our environment, and you can see here that it is a status of 1, and it's to my session only. If we went over here and we made this a comma -1, we execute that, and then we look at our dbcc trace status again, now you're going to see that it's a global session. The reason why I wanted to pull up the SQL Server Configuration Manager again is because we can go over here to our services, and when we look at our SQL Server Enterprise Edition, for example, we can go over here to Properties, and we could go up to our startup parameters, and we could add a startup parameter here. So we could say we want to do -T and 3226, and we want to add that. We want to hit apply, and next time that we would start our SQL Server instance, and let's look at that again, I double-clicked on SQL Server, I went over to startup parameters, and I added my -T 3226. That will allow that trace flag that will start that trace flag each time SQL Server starts up and is executing. Let's go back. over here. So that is a real quick example of how you could enable and use trace flags. Let's turn this off real quick here. And you would do the same thing as you did trace on, and we would do trace off, and F5, and now if we do our DBCC trace status, and I need to turn the -1 off as well. And you can see it turned it off for the session level. Now we should see that it's off for the global level as well. And it is, and there we go. Okay, and now it's turned off. Live demos, live demos. All right, so let's go back to our slide deck. So that was working with trace flags. TempDB configuration. For TempDB, we only have a single TempDB per SQL Server. This is still one of our bottlenecks within SQL Server. It's one of those things that SQL 2005, 2008, 2008, I've always asked for an additional TempDB. I always get laughed at when I ask for an additional TempDB. I'm like, my Sybase does it, and then they kick me out of the room. Our TempDB is used for things like sorting operations, user-defined temp tables, index, work tables, and if you have memory spills. So when you configure your TempDB, we want it isolated to our best performing ones. This is a single point of contention within your SQL Server instance. We want to avoid RAID 5 as TempDB can be quite write intensive, especially with those memory spills, your sorts. If you're re-indexing and you're doing your sort in TempDB, if you're using recommitted snapshot isolation level, you want to have a performing TempDB that performs. You want to size your TempDB to match your server workloads. So what do you mean by that, Dan? You want to monitor your environment and watch your TempDB. If your TempDB, if every time you restart your SQL Server instance, your TempDB starts out at 4 gig, which every time you restart your SQL Server instance, your TempDB is recreated. If you know it's going to grow to 30 gig, then it may just be best to have your TempDB set to be allocated and utilize 30 gig once your SQL Server instance starts. Occasionally, trace flag 1118 could improve your TempDB performance. I have really seen improvements with SQL Server 2016, and out of all the SQL Server 2016 instances I have installed and configured up to date, I have not needed to enable that trace flag. And create one TempDB data file per core up to eight data files. So if you have a 4 virtual CPU server, create your TempDB to have 4 data files. If you have 32 cores on your database server, only up to 8. If you have 64 cores on your database server, only set your data files up to 8. Recently, a good friend of mine and Matt Gordon, we were working in an environment and we were playing with a lot of these configurations on a 192 core server, and we found that best practices in these configurations still held true. Same for TempDB. I have only seen once where extending TempDB past 8 was beneficial to the environment. Other considerations other post-installation configurations that you may want to consider when setting up your SQL Server instance. We have our max memory, we have our max degree of parallelism, we have our backup compressions, we have, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, our model database settings, and we have our error log considerations. With respect to max memory, so max memory is one of those tricky things, right? I've had some interesting discussions out in the environment where, well, Dan, do you really need to set max memory? And my answer is always yes. And you said it there's some great formulas out there in environment, but you don't want to leave it unrestricted, because SQL Server will take all the memory on your box. It will. I promise you it will, because I forgot to set it on my VMs and it takes everything. Some recommendations there are to leave enough memory on your OS. For example, if I had a 8 gig, if I had a 12 gig server, I would give 8 to SQL Server. I would leave 4 for the OS. If I had a 70, a larger database server, I would give, like, for example, if I had a 72 gig database server, I would give 66 to SQL Server, leave an additional overhead of 6 gig of memory for the OS and other processes. That may vary based on what you have in your environment. I've seen where I've needed to give more memory to the OS based on security programs running and other external processes that are on the DB server. Max degree of parallelism. We recommend that you set your max degree of parallelism up to a max of 8 with the number. We recommend that you set, I recommend that you set up your max degree of parallelism to a max stop of 8, and change it from 0. Now, you also want to take into consideration, let me rephrase that. I recommend you reconfigure your max degree of parallelism. Set it to equal to the number of cores on your box up to a max degree of parallelism of 8. That way, when you're running your processes and they know they need to go parallel, they will only use up to 8 threads with the worker thread. So you could have up to 9 threads running for any particular process. We also, my friend Matt Gordon and I, we play with this a little bit on the 192 core server, and we bumped, let's say, the max degree of parallelism up to 62. We still found that the best practice, the recommended best practice of 8 still stood, and we got better performance on queries when we left it at the max degree parallelism 8 for that particular server. I recommend that you set up backup compression. If you have additional CPU, additional 4 or 5% CPU available on your server when you're doing backups, utilize backup compression. It'll drastically reduce the footprint of, it'll drastically reduce your footprint of your backups. Model database settings. So this is an interesting one, and it could be up for debate, right? But I recommend that you change your model database settings, and I recommend that you set the file size and the log size to something that's meaningful in your environment. For example, you may want to set your data file size to be created at 500 meg and your log to be created at 100 meg with your auto growth, and that's set to a reasonable size. And you may also want to consider to set it to simple mode as well. If somebody does not put in there for example, the paths, the size of the database they're creating, if they just let it choose the default settings, it's going to use the model database. So if I just say create database Dan, it's going to use those model database settings. And let's say, for example, I set my database up and it got created as full. My transaction log could fill over time, because if I didn't change the model database settings from full to simple, my database Dan would have the settings of full, and it would, my transaction log would fill the drive. So some considerations there. So look at your model database settings and tweak them from the initial settings that are there from the installation, that are set up during your installation. Error log considerations. Set your error logs to recycle every so often. I like to set mine to recycle every day, and I like to keep at least 35 to 40 days worth of error logs on my server. The reason why I like to reset my error logs daily is that if your error log gets too big, it's going to be a daunting task to open that up and try and look through the error messages and try and open up. One time I ran into a 128 gig, let's say 104 gig. I think I want it to be 128 gig, but I believe it was 104 gig error log that I just couldn't open. The server had been running forever, which speaks volumes to SQL Server, but there were so many error messages in the log and over time that we just couldn't really open up the error log in a timely fashion, and we couldn't sort through it properly. So think about setting that up and making it so that it recycles daily and only keeps so many versions out there. You could also recycle it weekly if you wanted to, every Sunday morning, or recycle it during your maintenance windows. Just make sure your error log doesn't get too large. Hardware and virtualization considerations. The goal of our job as DBAs is to make sure we have balanced hardware. We have a pool. If we have poor use of our resources or we have unbalanced hardware, we could have processors waiting on storage, we could have insufficient memory, we could have swapping the disks, and bottom line, sorry about that, it's a waste of money. If we have a server that's running at 20% utilization and we're not using the memory and we have 128 gig, it's just a waste of money. We also have unpredictable performance. One of the things I always talk about, and people slap me over the head, is do I have predictable performance in my environment? If I do, that's great. But if I don't have predictable performance, I can't tell my end users that you should expect this query to run in X amount of time, or you expect this job to finish in 5 minutes versus 10 minutes. I need to be able to predict that performance. So we have sockets, CPUs, and cores. Basically, you have on our motherboards today, we have sockets, and within that sockets we have processors, and then on those processors we have cores. And the number of cores has been growing significantly, so we can have 192 core servers and only have 4 sockets on those boards. So you'll see that these days. I still prefer the Intel chip these days. I have seen some AMD chips. They've worked fine. For my high performing servers, I still recommend the newer Intel chipsets. Hyperthreading. Hyperthreading is interesting, right? So if I have 72 cores, let's just say, on my server, and I open up perfmon, or I open up Profiler, or not Profiler, but Task Manager or Performance Monitor, all of a sudden now I have 144 cores. Woohoo! No. And that's the first time I saw it, I didn't look if hyperthreading was on. I thought I had the best box in the world. Hyperthreading is basically, it makes it look like you have the double number of cores available to you. What you should expect to see with hyperthreading turned on, and I recommend leave it on in most cases unless you're truly seeing issues with respect to hyperthreading, and that'll take a lot of troubleshooting and working through the issues with your server team and looking through the OS stack. But if you're not having issues, you can get about a 30% boost in your processing by leaving hyperthreading on. So I always recommend leaving it on. You want to have a balanced server. So you want to have a balanced set of CPU, memory, and disk storage on your server. You want to have the CPUs that make sense. You want to have the amount of memory and memory speed that makes sense. And you want to have the disk storage that makes sense. Our Microsoft Azure templates, if you've ever looked at them, are a great example. They balance it out. They say, okay, if you're going to utilize 4, if you're going to have 1 core, we recommend that you have 3.5 gigs of RAM, and you have 50 gigabit of disk size. So let's talk a little bit about Azure VMs. So we talked about, understanding and balancing your workload. Well, VMs can help us understand what balancing our workload is. We have our standard tiers, we have our medium tiers, and we have our premium tier Azure VMs. And based on your needs, you would utilize either that standard, medium, or premium. I just have a quick example over here of what a standard tier would look like. But if you needed to go up, for example, you could use your medium or premium tier, and you would get 60% faster processing. You would get the solid state drives, the faster drives up to 600 meg per second, I believe it is, on for the drive for your I/O throughput, but it's that balancing act. So when we go to Azure VMs as well, we want to make sure that we choose the proper Azure environments. And a lot of folks have gone to Azure and they automatically assume that they need the premium tier to do what they need without understanding their environment and balancing it out. So it goes back to that balancing act. Balance out your CPU, your memory, and your disk. Do I really need 16 cores and 56 gig of RAM with 800 gig of memory? That's going to cost me $2.24 an hour when I could really use 2 cores, 7 gigs, and cut my cost dramatically to 28 cents an hour. It's that balancing act. So understand what you need to balance out your environment. So and we talked about this real quick here, but each tier has a balance, and the more you pay, the faster it goes. Don't pay for more than you need. That goes for Azure, that goes for virtualization, and that goes for physical servers. So how do we know how to balance this? And we're going to talk about baselining a little bit later in the fundamentals here, and we can baseline or we can estimate performance. I personally, if I can, I like to baseline my performance before I make any sort of migrations. You can estimate performance by saying I'm going to have 100,000 transactions per hour. These transactions are going to be 500 meg in size per transaction, and you can, or 50 meg in size per transaction. 500 meg would be a big XML file. And I'm going to need X amount of throughput, but that's an estimate. So you may overestimate, and I find that my estimates as a DBA are usually overestimated. I usually have more resources on my server than I need, and then I need to determine a way to use those resources I've overestimated. If we baseline our performance, we get a better feel for what we need and what we need to move to. So some things we have to baseline our performance are items like perfmon. We have the Microsoft Data Management Warehouse, which I've used. I'm not scared to use when I go into an environment and I need to get some information about what's taking place on the servers and how they're being utilized. We have the dynamic management views, and you also have third-party vendors, and you have things like SolarWinds, Splunk, SQL Sentry. So if you have the extra budget and if you properly balanced your service, you may have the budget to buy one of those third-party vendors to baseline your performance. Some strengths with respect to perfmon is it's one of the oldest products built into Windows. It provides this info at the OS level. It has counters when you install SQL Server on your instance. You're going to have counters such as I/O statistics. You're going to see your buffer pool, your memory, basically your memory pool. You can pull those statistics within perfmon. It's easy to use. It's really easy to use and set up, and it's easy to build reports in Excel off of. There's a lot of reports out there that you can download from the web and throw your perfmon output into into an Excel spreadsheet. You can also create templates. If you have to push this out to a bunch of different servers, you can set up a template and push that from server to server. The weakness here is you do all the work. If you're a sole DBA at your environment and you're doing all the work and you're providing all the input and the troubleshooting and the releases, doing this could be going back through and looking at your perf-mon stats could be a daunting task, but at least you have them. Dynamic management views. We're definitely going to talk about this a little later in the baselining module and the troubleshooting module, but the strengths, it's been with us since SQL Server 2005, and they keep getting better. We keep getting more and more information. For example, I/O stats and the CPU stats, they're just providing much more detailed information that we didn't have, let's say, in SQL Server 2000. It's easier to gather data. We can run our DMVs, but once again, the weakness here is we have to do all the work. We have to put in place a mechanism to gather these dynamic management views, and a lot of them reset when you restart your SQL Server, so you need to have a running total, and you need to create reports, either an SSRS report or a Power BI report on top of these, the data you're gathering from your DMVs. Microsoft Data Management Warehouse. It is a great utility. It gathers and stores our performance data. It comes with many built-in reports. It does all the work, and it's free. The setup is a little clunky, and I point that out, and it gets a little cumbersome when you set it up. And we'll look at what management data warehouse looks like a little bit further in our baselining troubleshooting module. We like to speak briefly about disk arrays when we're talking about SQL Server. The most important thing I'm going to point out here on this slide is that we prefer 1.0 or RAID 5. RAID 5 is right here, and basically we have a set of disks. We have a parity disk that will maintain across the drives in case one of the drives failed. If we lose multiple drives inside our array goes down and we can have disk corruption. The benefits of RAID 1+0 is that you have not only the speed benefits of, let's say, 1+0, you have the speed benefits of your RAID 0, where it's just a set of disks being written to, but you also have a mirror, so you have that redundancy. I would put my TempDB on RAID 1.0 if I were having performance issues with it. If you need to, you can put it on RAID 5. The definite downside I want to mention to RAID 1.0, though, is it's double the space. So if I have a terabyte of space over here on RAID 1 on the left side, I'm going to have a terabyte of space over here on disk 2 and 3. So that is the downside of that. Database file group of files. When we look at our databases, we like to recommend, well, let's first take a look at a database. A database is comprised of a file group, and we have our data file, and then we have our log file. By default, when we create a database, it's the primary file group. We like to recommend that you create an additional file group when you create a database, and then set it as default. And then you put all your new data files in there. The primary reason I recommend this is, especially if you have a database in full recovery mode, if you want to do an online recovery, the first thing you need to do is recover the primary file group here that has all your system tables in it. If that has your data files in there, your tables in there that are, let's say, 500, 600, 700 gig, you're defeating the purpose of having an online recovery. You want to get this primary file group up and running, so then I can start restoring my other file groups, for example, with my key business data, and then I can restore the other file groups as time permits. We like to see when we set up a database, and we set up multiple files in there. So when you set up additional NDFs within your database, we like to see them equally sized on the same file group grow. This way they can take advantage of your round robin. So they will write to that particular NDF within your file group, and once that NDF gets within a certain threshold, it'll round robin and it'll start writing to your other NDF and so on and so forth. That way you don't have a hotspot within your database on your disk. Each file can be on separate LUNs or volumes. Spread our I/O to different devices we can. And that's probably a 30-minute discussion we could have here, because I have those discussions a lot with folks, in that, well, my data is just all in one place anyhow. Do I really need to do this? Does it really help performance? Yes. If you can separate them, get them on different devices. Never add additional log files. One is sufficient. The log file is round robin. Adding an additional log file will not help with your performance. The only time I will add an additional log file is if I'm in a critical state, my log file is full and I have no more room on my data drive. I'll create an additional log file to get my database back online to provide that space. I will find what filled my log file and get those committed and checkpointed, so my log file frees up, and then drop that additional log file at during an outage window. Once again, I mentioned here, use custom file groups. Set the default to one of these new file groups you create. That way you move it off of all your system tables, so that if you do have to do a piecemeal or an online restore, you can. Once again, one log per database, multiple files spread over separate physical volumes, and separate our log and data onto different physical volumes. Just real quick, a lot of us as DBAs don't work with the network, but be familiar with these tools. Be familiar with ping, netstat, route, traceroute, ipconfig, and your Windows firewall. Also look at tools like Wireshark. That way, when you're working with your network team, you can talk with them about the tools that may be able to be used, or if they're using those tools, you'll know what they're talking about and you can speak intelligently with them about the issue that you're trying to solve. In this stack, we talk a lot about virtualization. Virtualization is just this. You have a hardware abstraction layer. You have your operating system, and then within that operating system, you have all your drivers. Then we have our hardware abstraction layer here right before our hypervisor, and then below the hypervisor, we have our hardware. So a lot of times this will be our guest here. You'll hear us refer to this portion up here as our guest. The bottom layer, you'll hear the hardware layer, you'll hear referred to as our host. That the hardware is hosting all of our guests. Best practices when it comes to virtualization: don't overcommit your physical processors. Understand your environment. Depending on environments, I have overcommitted by 1.2 or 1.4%. Understanding the environment, especially if I have a lot of servers that run at different times, I never recommend overcommitting memory. That'll set you up for failure, definitely. Use dynamic memory. Use virtual hard disks or pass-through disks dependent upon your environment. And then understand that there's licensing with respect to virtualization with SQL Server. If you have enough instances and you're at the breakpoint, you can license at a host level and pay for the cores on the host versus the cores on your guests, and you can sometimes save costs with respect there in virtualization, and you need to determine the breakpoint. So you need to put together a spreadsheet or do some math and say, you know, I have 4 virtual cores, and I have Enterprise Edition that cost me $14,000. If I have 20 of these servers, is it going to cost me more to license 20 individual hosts versus licensing my guests? And actually, let me see where we are here. I had us to take a break at where? This is a good place for us to stretch our legs and ask some questions if there are any questions up to this point. What I would like to, as you're taking a break, let's see if there's any questions here. All right, so, shoot. Liz, can you see the questions?
Yes.
Okay, so that is a good question. What do I mean by don't use default storage? We recommend you use VHDX and VHDS. I need to update that slide and make it more meaningful, but that's what I mean by don't use the default storage when setting up the VMs. So I will update that slide. That's a great question, and when I looked at that, it threw me a little bit off guard as well. So within when you set up a VM, the VM administrators have the ability. So the question is, what does use dynamic memory mean? When you're setting up a VM, you have the ability to utilize dynamic memory within your environments, and it won't consume all the memory up front off of the host. However, if I have a memory starved host or one that's getting close, I'll set my memory to static. So that's something you'll work with your VM administrators on. And why can't I blow up these questions, Liz? I'm having a tough time doing that.
You can pull it out of the panel, but I can read them off if need be.
Okay, there we go. And if I can, if you want to follow up also with follow-up questions. So Microsoft recommended to not use hyperthreading. Quentin mentioned back at 1140. I'm going to have to go back and look at that, Quentin, because, or Ran, because recently with a lot of the Microsoft folks I've been working with, they have indicated that they would allow or would prefer that hyperthreading be turned on in most cases. So Quentin or Ran, so that was a stance I think about 3 or 4 years ago, but recently the folks I've been working with have said leave hyperthreading on. Is there a way to programmatically tell whether a server is a VM, like read the registry? So yes, if you do an MS Info 32 on your server, you can find out if your server is a VM. There are also some DMVs, and it's escaping me off the top of the head, in 2016 that may indicate whether or not it's a VM as well. But the easiest way to do that is to go to the server level and look at MS Info 32, and that'll tell you whether or not is set up to be a VM. Ryan, yeah, let me, if we have time, I can show how to change the default behavior of the error log. If we don't get to it here, that may be a good blog post, or I can send you that in email as well if you want to follow up with email. Will these recommended settings be posted with the slide deck? Yes, these recommended settings will be in the slide deck. Should TempDB data files be on separate spindles if possible? Rick, if you can put TempDB on separate spindles, go for it, my friend. The faster you get, the better off you are. Good questions, good questions. So sorry, our aliases. So Rodney asked, are aliases set up at the client side or the SQL Server side? Aliases in this case that I mentioned, they are set up on the SQL Server side. So I typically prefer CNAMEs over SQL Server aliases, but dependent upon the environment you're in, some folks will not allow you to use CNAMEs. So that is when I've used SQL Server aliasing. So, but it is set up on the SQL Server side. So wherever you have your SQL Server instance, it'll be set up there. How does the 2016 SP change the addition matrix? Wow. So Harry, so if you have to do anything that's still OLTP related and you need your databases or your data to be highly available or available to the clients, the updates do change the matrix a little bit. However, so we're going to get partitioning and we're going to get more advanced availability groups and we're going to get items like that and in memory. However, they limit the scope of what you can do there. So it's going to be dependent upon what you need to do. It doesn't change the cost though. However, if you can utilize the watered down versions, not the watered down versions, but the versions that are provided to us with that allow you to use fewer resources, you can save costs there. And I wish it was snowing down here, Tom. Oh, Tom has left. Okay. All right. So real quick, we opted after. Oh, some more questions came in. Microsoft Azure recommends all SQL files on SSD. That is correct. If I'm in a dev environment, I may put SQL Server on a if I'm doing a dev environment, I may put that fill on a standard edition so I don't spend the money. But yes, if I'm doing a production level SQL Server environment, SSDs are definitely a requirement. Where do you see the RAID levels your storage is configured with? Where can we see it? So Pradeep, that you're going to have to make friends with you're going to have to make friends with your network engineers and ask them what RAID levels they're using for you. And race flag 1117 and 1118 will have no effect in SQL Server 2016. That is correct. I believe it's Yuri. That is correct. So Yuri points out that trace flag 1117 and 1118 will have no effect in SQL Server 2016. That is absolutely 100% correct. So if you're running anything below 2016, you may need it, but they've made huge improvements within the environment. Huge improvements with respect to 2016, and their tagline is it just runs faster. So before we continue on here, I wanted to if you go to pragmaticworks.com and you saw that we had the streaming, we have the 20% off the on-demand streaming for the DBA Fundamentals. You can see here that we have the course here, and I've only taken 2% of it. That's not right. But so we have our courses here, and you can see here you can get 20% off of the DBA Fundamentals, which goes into more detail. But what I wanted to show is that, and real quick, we'll only look at the top portion in this little break, but we have a lot of classes already put together. Some of the exciting ones up top here are our advanced SRS. We've updated that recently. We've updated our SSIS course, and this course here, which is new, our advanced T-SQL Pro class. is an excellent class to take. It's one of those that I really enjoyed. It's a lengthy course. It's about 16 hours or more, but it's well worth its weight in gold. It's a great class. One of our instructors, Mitchell, he put it together, put a lot of great time and effort into that. So this is what our on-demand portal will look like. And a lot of the topics that we're going to cover today, you can get more advanced detail into and dive into the basics. So once you have the very high level of what these objects are, you can dig in a little deeper. We actually internally take these courses as well. For example, if I'm a DBA and I haven't done SSIS in a long time, I'll come back in here and use these courses. So we even use these courses internally to kind of refresh ourselves and get back on track, because if you don't use it, you lose it. Hey Rajesh, SQL Server, we opted after the SQL Server instance being installed in 2014. How to identify, Rajesh, how to identify what type of licensing we opted after the SQL Server licensing after being installed? You could pull it from, Rajesh, can you send me an email? I'd like to talk a little bit about this. You should be able to pull that information from the DMVs, and I'll try and dig that DMV up for you so we can determine what licensing model you do truly and have there. All right, so yes, and my email will be in the slide deck, but definitely that's something I would like to take offline, and definitely based on that last thing, any third after, yeah, let's talk about that. I do have some recommendations there. It's going to be detailer@pragmaticworks.com, but it'll also be in the slide deck, so it will be there. But detailer at oh. All right, so something has timed out here on me. All right, let's get back to the slide deck. And all right, so let's talk a little bit now that everybody should be back from break. Let's talk a little bit now about our SQL Server on-premise and in the cloud. We're going to look at a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about terminology just real quick and some of the pros and cons. You'll see this slide out there, you know, the pizza as a service. So here you can see if we have our traditional on-prem type environment, we do everything. This is make it home. It's our family recipe. We supply the dining room table all the way down to the cheese. If we do it software as a service, it's a dine-out restaurant. They've got everything for us. They've got the dining room table and they've got the cheese. We sit down, they serve it. And then we have something like in the middle there, we have infrastructure as a service. And we provide some of the information or some of the ingredients, whereas somebody else provides something. So in this case, DiGiorno. And then platform as a service, you would consider it something like Pizza Hut. We have the dining room and the table and the soda. They've got everything else. They even have the soda. But let's look at it from a version where, thank you, Salita. So let's look at it from a real world event here versus pizza as a service. So we have infrastructure as a service, PaaS and SaaS there. And our traditional on-premise, we have everything. We have our applications, we have our data, we have our runtime, we have our middleware, we have everything. We control everything. And then over on the right-hand side, you have software as a service. So everything is being run in the cloud. Typically what I've seen or I've been working with lately is the two in the middle here, infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. For example, Microsoft would provide, you know, or the vendor, let's just say, manages our virtualization, our servers, our storage, our networking. We would supply what OS we need, the middleware, our runtime, our data, and our applications. And then here, platform as a service, you would have your applications and data, and then everything else would be managed. So this would be if you wanted to set up a virtual machine, say in Microsoft Azure, and this would be here if you wanted to do Azure SQL DB. So with infrastructure versus PaaS, we would have SQL Server in our Azure VM. This is where we spoke about that there, the infrastructure service. We would bring our own pre-licensed image. We could bring our own pre-licensed image, and we connect to it like a traditional server/instance. For example, we just like we would connect through terminal services or RTP on-prem, we would connect versus with the RDP session that's provided to us via the Azure portal. With the Azure SQL database, we have limited customization and management, but you connect directly to the database servers. So they handle everything else for us other than the internals to the database. Why on-prem versus our cloud? You know, it's data center availability, our hardware costs, our administration costs, our application types that we deploy. So if we are looking at needing an additional data center, maybe it's worth moving our colo to Microsoft Azure. It may reduce our overall cost. It's all dependent upon what our needs are. Hardware costs. Hardware costs can be expensive. Maintaining them can be expensive. If we spin up everything, not everything, but let's say we have some on-prem and some off-prem, we can reduce some of the hardware costs of not needing to order those additional servers. There's the administrative costs. And this has been a very interesting discussion out in the community, right? How many of us, what are our job roles going to be in the future? And I think our job roles are just going to change. We're going to still need infrastructure as a service in the cloud, so we're going to still need some sort of network engineers there, server engineers, and we're going to have databases in the cloud. We're going to still need database folks, database administrators, database developers to be able to deploy these things. And dependent upon your types of applications deployed, maybe software as a service, using TFS in the cloud, for example, maybe something rather than having that on-prem. Some of the on-prem advantages are you're fully customizable, it's physically accessible. If you like touching the servers, that's a huge advantage. If you like being able to maintain and ensure that everything is set up the way you expect it to be set up, it's a huge advantage. It's managed by your own staff completely. You know who has access to the servers at every time, every minute of the day. You have flexible provisioning within reason, right? If you run out of floor space, do you have flexible provisioning? And you have full access to the configuration and setup. Some disadvantages are you have additional management staff are required to handle those networks, to handle the servers, to handle your storage arrays. We may need to wait. If we order a new Dell server or HP server, we may have to wait for that physical hardware to be set up. And it can be vulnerable to local disasters. When I was at New York Life as a full-time employee there, we were right at the end of Tampa runway. And we would see the planes fly overhead, and I would duck sometimes when the shadows came over because I swear they were flying low, but some of our servers were there, so they were vulnerable to local disasters. You know, we have our cloud pros and cons. Still, so so vulnerable local disasters, also snowstorms. Some of you are getting snow up north. You can't get in. Power goes out. Ice storms are horrible. I remember living up in New England and New Hampshire. Ice storms are horrible. Down here in Florida, we have the constant threat of hurricanes brushing our coast or flooding our data centers. So there's all kinds of disasters you can speak of. We have our cloud pros and cons. We can reduce our administrative costs. We have no hardware cost. There's a lot of built-in HADR that it's worth looking into, and the upgrades are all built in to your, for example, Microsoft Azure. They handle all that for you. You can spin up an environment with little to no waiting. You know, basically, you go through the portal or through PowerShell and you start spinning up what you need. And by the time, 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, you have a new server or database ready and waiting for you. We have limited customization, which is a disadvantage with respect to Azure SQL. We have to reside within the Microsoft confines. Now that's always changing, and Microsoft is taking a cloud-first approach. So any new features that are within, for example, SQL DB, they'll usually make it there first versus on-prem. So that's an advantage where the limited customization is a disadvantage. We have no direct physical management. I didn't normally touch the servers, so for me it wasn't ever a big issue. I haven't found many limitations to going to the cloud from what I used to do and the performance tuning that I used to handle. And internet performance impacts app speed. So that is, Salita, that's why I hadn't quite answered you. So yes, dependent upon your internet bandwidth, yes, you can have performance impacts. And this was where we were supposed to take our first break, but we took our break, and it's just right now you can get 20% off your DBA Fundamentals on-demand training. Perfect gift for your SQL Server geek. That is correct, Phil. And that's designing your app correctly, Phil. So Phil answered back, unless the app is in the cloud too. So if you're running all your services and you're running SaaS, software as a service, and you've got that in the cloud, all your networks internal to that particular region. So your performance could, should I say, Phil, possibly be better than your on-prem. So let's quickly look at SQL Server and database security. We're going to talk about the surface area configuration. You have servers, roles, and logins within SQL Server. You have database roles and users, and we have contained users as well. So surface area configuration. The reason I like to point this out and put it in a fundamentals class is because what I will see a lot is, and it's not a good or bad, well, I wouldn't do it, but a lot of times I'll see all the SQL Server components installed on a particular instance or a server when I walk into an environment, and it wasn't intended. It was just they clicked on, did the default install, and everything gets installed there. It's recommended you only install your necessary components and configure only what's necessary. For example, don't configure FileStream if you're not gonna need it. Don't install SQL Server reporting services if you're not gonna need it. One, they're gonna consume resources, maybe minimal resources, but they're gonna consume resources on a box that you may need those resources. And two, there's additional components that you need to patch. So if a cumulative update comes out, a service pack comes out, or a Microsoft security patch comes out, you're going to have to patch all these components on that box, which could lead to downtime. So only install what's needed. It seems like common sense, but I see it happen more than not. So just be careful of that. We have logins. We have logins within our SQL. We have two types of logins. We have Well, let's just say we have logins. I think this slide needs to be tweaked a little bit here. Our logins can be linked to users, and it's a traditional part of our SQL Server security. Okay, I remember why that's there now. So we have our SQL login, and we have our SQL, we could have a SQL Server login, which is a login that's only associated with that particular instance, or we can use Windows authentication and create a login there. We have server roles. Server roles are efficient ways to grant us server level access. For example, you have sysadmin, you have security admin, you have DB creator. When adding to these server level roles, use care. For example, when I was setting up at an environment, my security team wanted to have sysadmin, and it wasn't that I didn't trust them, but I didn't want to allow them or have the capability to accidentally stop and start my SQL Server instance. So they just needed to see security information about the box. So I gave them security admin and some read writes. So when you're providing these server level roles, just take care, and you can create custom roles as well to meet the needs of your consumers. We have users within our database, and this is very similar to the other database platforms out there. We have they're database specific, and we can control our database access and permissions. Jason, there will be some more demos coming up. Yes, yes, there will be some more demos coming up. Are you talking about database roles and users and login specific? So Ryan, I don't have anything in here about AD authentication as it relates to Azure DBs. So maybe you and I can take that offline. Okay, so with respect to the users, we require a login for authentication. There's a little excerpt there, unless it's a contained database. Once again, we have our fixed roles within our database. We have our DB owners, we have our writers, and we have our data readers. We have flexible roles where we can create, and then we have our MSDB roles, and I didn't mention it here, but we also have our SSIS DB roles. So here, these are our fixed roles. Be cautious when granting these two folks. It grants, for example, if you grant data reader, it grants them data reader to every component, every table within that particular database. Same for data writer and so on and so forth. I like to, if I need to narrow down what I allow access to within my database, I'll use user-defined roles and grant the access to the particular tables or stored procedures that they need access to there. With the SSIS DB roles in 2016, I like to point out that in 2014 and below it, or with SSIS IDB, you had to do some tweaks to allow people access to reports, but they have added a reader role in SSIS DB these days that allows us to allow our users access to the SSIS reports outside of being admin on the box. We have contained users, and these are users that are just they log in through the database level, and it must be enabled at our instance and database level, but they only access to that database, and they only are allowed information to that database. Let's go over real quick. So, all right. All right. So we'll close this down real quick. So see, we've covered a lot here. So So let me see here. What can we do a quick demo on with respect to what we covered? So real quick, we talked about databases. So with our database, let's expand out our database here. And I've been having slight issues with my environment. And let's create a new database. So we can visually see this, and we're going to call this database Takeover DB. We're going to change our owner. We're going to change this to SA for this. And now here you can see by default that we have two file groups. We have our primary file group. Well, we have one file group. We have our primary file group, but we have two database files. We have our TempDB and we have our TempDB log. I mentioned that we wanted to add an additional file group and make it as our default. So here we're going to add our takeover DB, and we're going to call it new default. And we're going to add it to a new file group, and we're going to call it new default. We're going to hit, and here we're going to click this radio or this box real quick here, and we're going to set this as default. So what this is going to do when we create our database is it's going to say that this is the new default. So if my users don't define in their create table statements the default file group, it will go here. In the past, if we hadn't created this new file group with the new NDF file, our new data drive here, everything would go to the primary. And if we needed to do a piecemeal restore, that could impact how long it takes us to do our piecemeal restore. Something I always like to do, and I like to do a script to new query window so that I have the script and I can put it in my TFS somewhere. We're going to click OK. And there we go. We created that takeover DB. And now if we go into our properties, we can go here and we can see that we have our new database. And of course, I would size these more specifically to the needs of my environment. But if I go down here to file groups, before we just had the primary file group, now you can see I have my new default file group with the wrong spelling name, and it's default. So any new items that are created will go inside here. And there's the script. If I wanted to put that in a repository somewhere, I could do so, and that's exactly what SQL Server is doing behind the scenes when it's creating this database. What else did we talk about during that session? We talked about perfmon, and there will be a perfmon demo a little bit later on. But you know what? Let's do one real quick here, and we can. So if we want to track, we talked about tracking some of our stats. So you can go here and you can go to your search, and you're going to look for perfmon, and right here you'll see it come up as performance monitor. We're going to click on that. And let's give ourselves a little real estate here. And here's what's happening by default. So you can see here that by default, we're collecting some stats. And we're only collecting processor time. So if we wanted to, we could go here, we could add counters, and we could go down, let's say, to SQL Server. And here I could pull, if you can see here, all of the SQL Server counters that it placed inside here during the install, that it created during the install. And we can track all these items. So if we wanted to, we could look at our buffer manager, and we could look at our buffer cache hit ratio. We could look at our data pages being used. And I'm hitting the control key while I'm selecting. We could, if we had extensions going on, but we could look at our page life expectancy and so on and so forth. We could hit that there. We could hit OK. And my machine is going a little slow. And that did not add them. But You get the gist of it. If we wanted to, we could add those items, and then we could also take this and we could create a data collector here, a user-defined data set. So we could collect our own data collector, and we'll call this Takeover. And this is if we wanted to have perfmon stats outside of the standard perfmon monitor that's running. So let me go through that again. We would go down here to user define. We would right mouse click. We would hit new. We'd hit data collector set. We would call it Takeover. We'd hit create manually. I don't want to create from a template at this point. We're going to click next. And we're going to create, we'll just select performance counter logs. We'll hit finish, and here we go. So now we could go and we could start this, and we have a data collector. And what this data collector, if we go over here now, we can hit right mouse click, we can hit properties, and we can add, and here we can see everything that our data collector is going to be gathering for us. So real simple and easy to set up. You can then take this data collector, you can save it off and import it into an Excel spreadsheet, say, for example. All right, so let's go back here. And there's more information inside the DBA Fundamentals. It goes in more detail into setting that up and how you would do it. And there's several labs in there as well that you walk through when going through that. Just you know, the time permitting, we may I wasn't able to walk through all the steps you would do to create the template in that. We have our backup and restore. Everybody should be doing backups of their databases. The question often comes up, when and how often should I back up, what types of backups, you know, and document. So what, when, and how often I back up is always defined by my end users. So when I get the question of what, when, and how often should I back up, basically back up everything that you can, our system databases especially, and our user databases. If you have the space, back them up. When to back them up is defined by our recovery time objective and our recovery point objective. Our recovery time is how quickly we need to get that database recovered. Our recovery point is at what point in time do we need to recover that database to? Do we need to recover it as close to the failure as possible, or can we recover from 24 hours ago? And how often we back it up will also be defined by our RTO and RPO. If we're okay with 24 hours worth of data loss, we're only going to back up that database every 24 hours. If we can only accept 15 minutes of data loss, and we need to recover relatively quickly, we may do more frequent log backups and more frequent differential backups to reduce our data loss and recovery time. And then if our recovery time objective is really short, we may start looking at things like availability groups. Within our backups, and this is like many other database platforms out there, but we have our full, our differential, our log, our file group backups, and our partial backups. Most commonly, you'll see full, differential, and logs in environments, but for those larger databases, you're going to want to start looking at doing file group and partial backups. Our full is just that. It backs up the entire database. Our differential contains all the changes since our last full backup. So there's some confusion around differentials sometimes, and it's not just the changes since your last differential. So if I did my full backup on Sunday and I do a differential on Monday, my Monday differential will contain all the data from Sunday to Monday. If I do a differential on Tuesday, that differential backup is going to contain all the data from Sunday to Tuesday and so on and so forth, up until our next full backup takes place. Our log backup contains all the log records since our last log backup. So if we took if we had transactions that took place and I did a log backup at noon, it would cover any, and I took the backup at 12:15, it would cover any of the transactions that took place in that time frame. And then we have our file group and our partial backups where we can back up one or more database files or file groups. And we have the partial where we can back up containing data from a primary file group. And every read-write file group that's available. We can't necessarily back up our read-only file groups. Well, we can back them up. Let me rephrase that. And the reverse could be said. We have our recovery scenarios here. We can do a full recovery, a differential recovery, a log recovery. We could do a file restore. We can do a page restore and a piecemeal restore. Most commonly, I'll do my full recoveries in combination with a differential and a log. I'll usually recover from my most recent full backup, then I'll get my most recent differential backup, and then I'll apply any log transactions from that point back. Then you can also do individual file restores, and you can do piecemeal restores. You can do with the file restore, you're restoring one or more of our damaged files. It is dependent upon our recovery model whether or not the database will stay online. We can also do a piecemeal restore, which restores and recovers the database in stages. So we can goes back, if we have partitioning, we can recover certain parts of our partition at particular times, so we can bring on our key business functions that need to be loaded and read, and then we can restore those other database files we can do the other database files later. Page restore I've only used a couple times in my career, and that's where you can actually just restore a particular page if you've identified a corrupt page. Lisa asked, does the full include and reset the logs? No, the full backup does not. It will include any transactions that take place in that log, but it does not allow you, it does not provide you the ability to recover those logs. So you still need to do a log backup. So if I do let me rephrase that, Lisa. Your full backup will have any committed transactions. You still need to do a log backup to capture any of the changes that have taken place since your full recovery. So if you did, or a full backup, if you did a full backup, let's say, Lisa, at noon today, and you didn't do a log backup until 5 p.m. this evening, your log you have the potential for 5 hours worth of data loss, and hopefully that answers your question. If not, I can work through you. I also have a couple webinars out there, backup and recovery, demos out there. Is there anything we could do to speed up the restore of a 1 terabyte database that I was only one MDF file and what we're currently doing? Salita, that's definitely, let's look at maybe addressing that question if we have at the end. Otherwise, let's address that via email, because there may be a way to help you there. It'll require a few changes from your backup, how you're doing your backups, but there may be a way to help the restore of that 1 terabyte database. And just some other things you may want to look into from a backup and recovery perspective. Go out there and learn about the tail of the log. If you have database corruption or you lose a database, the tail of the log is going to be your friend. It's also going to be your friend when you do piecemeal recoveries. It's going to be part of that recovery process. Learn about copy-only backups. Copy-only is great. I use copy-only when I'm moving from one database environment to the other, and I don't want to break my backup log chain or my backup chain. And then there's third-party vendors that can do backups for you. For example, oh gosh, now I'm forgetting the tool out there, but it does very well with compressing the database backups. The not Lightspeed, yeah, Lightspeed. So let's pop over here real quick over to our instance, SQL Server instance. Sound effects. All right. So let's just say we have our, we'll have our takeover DB. And this is going to be a very high level backup. So there's multiple ways we can do a backup. So let me first check my database model here. Okay, it's in full mode. Good. All right, I wanted to make sure that it was in full mode. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over here. We're going to right mouse click on our database. We're going to hit tasks, and over here you can see backup. Now it's going to ask us for our backup location, and I've already got inside my database properties. I've got that defined where I want my backups to go. Well, let's take a step back. Let me show you that real quick. So if we go over here real quick to our server, just a little thing I want to show you, and we hit properties and we go to database settings. Here you can see that if I had compressed backup turned on, you could see that here. Also here, I already have predefined where I want my backups to go, and that's why that came up there, because I have my backups defined going to my E drive. So let's go back to our backup. We're going to go here. We're going to go source database, and we're going to just back up to our takeover DB backup. And I forgot to do something. So all right, let's do that one more time. All right, we're going to go tasks, backup. We're going to do full, and we're going to script this out. And we are going to compress the backup. So here, if you didn't have by default within your database server, say you're using a tool such as Commvault that doesn't like when you do compression backups, but you're backing up to your disk for some reason, you need to move it from one server to another, or you're having issues and you want to back up locally, you can come in here and override the server-wide settings. We're going to back up to disk. We're going to back up to our E drive, and we're going to overwrite all existing backups. Live demos, folks. All right. So we're going to hit cancel here. All right. So if that did not do what I needed it to do, but we are going, so here you can see that through the GUI, this is what is being done in the background. So here we can say, okay, backup database, and we'll run it through the scripts in this case, just to show what's happening inside and underneath the covers. And then here we're going to put a comma, and we're going to do replace. And I am going to get rid of this, and we're going to hit execute. And of course, my all right, we're going to hit execute. There we go. All right. And for some reason, it is not, oh. Well, that explains a lot right there. I was on. So make sure you're on the right server before you do anything. All right. So I was on the wrong server, folks. So I apologize for that. So right here, we're going to right mouse click. We're going to tasks. We're going to back up our database. We're going to remove this because that was something we're going to add. We're going to go to our eBackup, and we're going to call it our wide world importers dot back, and here I put dot back. For transaction log backup, I usually put TRN. For differential, I put DIFF. That could be anything you want it to be, so just keep that in mind. That doesn't necessarily say you're not going to, you can't recover this. It's just good information for other people in your environment, and that's a standard we like to use out there. So we're going to hit OK. And now we should see over here on our backups, I have a worldwide importers backup. Now, if we want to, we could go back and we could go right mouse click, and if we, so our database here is in full recovery, so we know we need to do log backups. So we would go to worldwide importers, and we would hit tasks, and we would hit backup, and here we could do the same thing, but we would do transaction log. So that's how you could do your backups through your GUIs. And then if you needed to recover those, you would go to tasks, restore database, and because it's pulling from the MSDB, it should see the most recent backup I did. And it does. So if I wanted to recover that, I could click OK, or I could hit script, and we could recover that way. Okay, that's real quick about backups and recoveries. And like I said, the DBA Fundamentals course goes a lot more in depth into them. Also, there's a couple webinars out there on our website that goes into more in depth about backup and recoveries. There's a first intro, and then there's an advanced. So let's continue from current slide. So we have our management tools within SQL Server. We have our SQL Server Management Studio. We have our that we're going to talk about. We have our central management server, and we have this cool thing called snippets that I love, that some people know about and some people haven't quite used. And, I love snippets. So SQL Server Management Studio, it's installed with. It used to be installed with the database engine. So if you're installing SQL Server 2014 and below, SQL Server Management Studio, also known as SSMS, is included in there. However, in the new SQL Server 2016 installs, it is no longer included in there. It gives you a link to download the new SQL Server Management Studio, but so you need to do that, and then you can install it from there. The cool thing about the standalone is, one, it gets updates more frequently, and the reason why I like these updates versus other updates is Microsoft is taking that cloud first approach. So if you want to test something or they implement something in the cloud, usually they bring it into the SQL Server Management Studio for us to test on the inside the cloud. So it's really neat that they have the standalone. Also, for example, and we'll show it in the extended events, they added some extended event traces that are really helpful in one of the later updates of the SQL Server Management Studio. And we use it to configure, monitor, maintain our SQL Server environment. So it's actually, so here it's, I said starting in 2015, it's actually called SQL Server Management Studio 2016 Salida, and yes, it is backward compatible with 2005. I have found some bugs in it. For example, if you're setting up database mirroring, the database mirroring you will need to do through scripting. It is broken in SQL Server Management Studio, but you can go back and you can query and you can look at your SQL agent jobs and that through the new SQL Server Management Studio. So that's what I recommend on my machines, and yes, it is backward compatible. We talked about that. So back in SQL Server 2008, they introduced a concept called Central Management Server, and you can have groups within it, and you can contain one or more SQL Server instances in this group. if you want to push out a bunch of information to all of your servers, you could do it through here. If you're doing policy-based management, you could control it through your CMS. I like using it to view the error logs. I also, if I get a lot of calls that we're getting blocking on this particular database, but I don't know what server it's on. Well, if I know it's a production server, I can look at all my locking queries across all my servers at one time. And we're going to, let's show a demo of that. So here, let me go back to my SQL Server instance. And oops. All right, we'll close that down. All right, so we're going to go over here and we're going to go. So inside have multiple DBAs. They don't have to register their own servers. They're all in CMS. That is, you have all your servers. Yes, that's why I like it. It goes back to documenting, right, Salita? It's a great place, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. But it's a great place to be able to maintain your list of servers. Now, I wish there was a way you could do it. I've seen a PowerShell that will go out and look at your environments and automatically add them to CMS. But you know, I wish there was a way to more easily. So here we're going to go. Sorry about that. My phone was ringing again. We're going to go, and did I start the right instance? I did. Okay. Whew. I thought I was on the wrong instance again. So, all right, what I did there was, all right, so if you're not seeing your registered servers, and you'll need to open this up to look at this, but you'll go to View, and you'll go to Registered Servers, and you'll click on this, and it'll open up this box here. We're going to hit the plus sign, and underneath here, you're going to see an item called Central Management Servers. We're going to right mouse click on this. We're going to hit, so I haven't registered this as a owner of the Central Management Server. So this would be a dev server or a production, someplace that all your DBAs have access to, or your individuals have access to, so that they could look at the CMS. So we're going to go register Central Management Server. We're going to give it a name. We'll call it Takeover. The theme of the day. We're going to use SQL HA Node 1. This is going to store all of our central management server information. It's going to be there's going to be some information stored within the MSDB, so there is information stored within there. We're going to test our connection. We're going to hit save, and right there we have a central management server set up and registered or configured. Now what we need to do is we need to go here and we need to do a new server registration. So I know I have SQL HA Node 2 up and running. We're going to test our connection. And this, it's important to note also that you have to use Windows authentication to be able to connect to the other servers. So you'll need some sort of Windows authentication. So in this case, I'm connecting through my SQL admin ID. I know SQL admin has access to the other servers. We're going to save this. And now let's say I had HA Node 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can go here and I can right mouse click and I can hit New Query, and I could select add a server name, for example, and this would return the server name, or even better, let's do version. If I wanted to find the versions of all my servers out there, it would go through all the lists of all my servers and return this information to one particular query window. And you can see down, well, if I had more servers, you would see all the servers that it was connected to. It would say 2 of 3, 2 of 24, and so on and so forth. So it's a great way to manage your servers. Now, if you want to, you can go here, and why did I go there? We can go here, sorry about the lag, folks. All right, we can go back to our Object Explorer. And we'll unpin CMS, and we're going to go into our databases, and we're going to go into System Databases, MSDB, Security, and Roles, and Database Roles. And here, you can see that there's been some operator roles. So if we wanted to give access to, just read access to some of our users out there, we could give them access here to read the CMS. So you can give folks read-only. So if you want folks to have read-only access to these database servers through CMS, you can do it that way. So you can control this, who has access and what access they have to the servers within CMS. All right. So current slide. All right, and this is actually, let's talk about snippets. So snippets are really cool. They're templates that come out of the box, and they're created when you install your SQL Server instance. A lot of folks know about them, but I find that still a lot of folks don't know them. You can also create your own snippets, and you can have templates out there and other folks, and you can share these snippets with other folks, or you can store them on a box and other folks can use them, and they can be accessed through the menu or Control-Alt-T. So let's look at snippets real quick. I love snippets, I really do. When somebody showed me snippets once, and I went, what? So we can hit our snippets or our Template Explorer either through going to View and Template Explorer, or we could hit Control-Alt-T. And what this is going to do is, and let's pin this, what this provides us is a set of SQL statements that have been defined for us. So if we wanted to, let's say, create a database or attach a database, they have all the scripts here. So let's say we want to let's just say bring a database online. We could double click on that, and there's the syntax for you. It's all within their it's all within here. So another, we talked about database roles, create a database role. There's the syntax for the create a database role and all the different grants you can give to that role. Yes, Lisa, the information, contact information will be made available in the slide deck. So snippets are really cool. If we wanted to, we could go in here and we could say new, and we could say folder or template, and we could create our own template in here, and we could say Dan's crazy query, because I am crazy and I write really bad queries. And then if I want, anybody who logged into this particular instance would have access to that query. So if there's a bunch of troubleshooting queries you want to have available to your folks, you can create a folder and you can put them here on the server. So it's a really nice utility within SQL Server Management Studio. All right, let me look real quick here. So we are slightly behind, and that's all on me. But we're up on the top of the hour. So let's take a quick break. Let's go get a drink. I'll be available for questions here. But once again, a friendly reminder that 20% off DBA Fundamentals On-Demand Training. I have a face for nothing. But anyhow, right now you can get 20% off our DBA. Thank you, Rajesh. And yes, good point. If everybody's reading the chat window, Karuba, and I hope I got the name right, Control-Shift-M helps you fill in the parameters. So that's something that we go over a little more detail in the labs and the fundamentals. But here we have the 20% off code. But also, let me go back. Well, if we still have people here. exit out, Dan. Don't need to need people make people dizzy. See if I still have that open. So here, this is back to our portal again, and you get to it through pragmaticworks.com. And when you sign up, you log in. I just want to point through some of the classes. We have our big data science course for beginners, which I still need to take. It's a great class put together, our great instructor. We have the introduction to SSAS, introduction to SSRS. So if you're a DBA, and you need to learn the functionality and how to utilize analysis services and SSRS, there's some great classes out here. And these classes provide you from the beginning level all the way to getting you up and running or creating a cube or creating a reporting services report or creating an integrated services catalog with a ton of labs. So I know this webinar is really fast and quick-paced and doesn't have as many labs as I would even like to have in it, or demos, but these classes have those in them. The mobile reports and dashboards with SSRS, very cool. SQL Server hardware and configuration, the high availability class, that's a great class. SQL Server performance tuning, great class. Class here about our ledger test. We have a tool that we provide out there, and it helps you do automated testing of your environment, and we have a class on that. Power BI, custom visualizations. There's an introduction in here to Power BI somewhere that is a good class, and I can't find it, but you can just see that we have about 30 plus courses here, and they're growing. And you know, without sharing the trade secret and Devin hitting me, which I'm not sure if he's here, we're building new courses all the time, and we have some exciting courses that are coming. Our on-demand training is something we're putting a lot of effort into, and not only are we getting information from our clients that we go on site with, I don't know. Devin may be able to answer that question if he is on the line. And if we don't get that, Phil, I'll try and get that information out if we have anything on deck with that. Devin, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Do you know, one of the questions came up, do you know if we have any classes planned with respect to Power Apps?
Oh, Power Apps. Not yet, just
Okay.
because it's so new and I'm expecting a lot of changes to happen with it. So maybe after it's been out for a little bit, we'll probably look at doing a course for that, but nothing yet.
Okay, Phil, so that answer, but you know, keep your eye open and your ear open, because we are putting a lot of stuff out there on a regular basis, and there's some exciting stuff going on behind the scenes. So and like I said, we use these classes internally as well for our juniors and seniors. What about I guess I know it's the pirate joke, Larry, but you know, it never ends for me. Devin,
Yeah, R would be on the roadmap. We'll probably have an R course later in 2017, so maybe about midway through the year, though. I can tell you some of the things we have more immediately we're looking at. So we're working on a data modeling course. If you're looking at modeling out data warehouses or even OLTP systems, we'll have a course for that. We'll also be working on 2 new DAX courses, one kind of an intro one and one advanced one. And then we're also looking at, we've already started developing a Tableau course. So if you come more from a data visualization side and use other tools outside of Microsoft like Tableau, we'll have a course for you there also.
Cool, thanks, Devin, thanks. And I think we got it, John, correct? Good, good, good. All right. While Devin was talking there, I thought we could walk through that again. And once again, this is you know, this is being recorded, so we can walk through. And please send me emails. I'm a little slow these days to get back to emails because I'm on client engagements through the end of February of next year, which is a great thing. It just takes me a little bit time to get back to y'all because I like to try and put due diligence into the emails I send back, and usually we have great conversations and we learn a lot about each other as well as the environment. So if I don't, what I will normally do is I will acknowledge that I received your email and try and provide a timeline around when I'll be able to respond to y'all, and provide detail to the question being asked. Okay, so we are at 1:05. Let's move forward here. Like I said, I'm a little bit behind, and that's my fault, and I apologize for that. So let's talk real quick about just querying SQL Server. And once again, this is really, really high level. And there's a great class, the advanced well, we have the intro to T-SQL class, which is excellent. And then we have the advanced T-SQL class, which is just by far, it's great. It goes through a lot of things like Windows events or Windows functions and joins and just a ton, a wealth of information, how to write good, proper SQL CTEs. It goes into CTEs and goes into functions when and not to use them, but great class. So it would build on this querying of SQL Server that I'm going to provide here, because I'm going to provide it from a very high level. We're gonna skip. I mean, we know it came from. Well, maybe we don't, but it came from Sybase, and it's Transact SQL, T-SQL for short. Within SQL Server, we have our miscellaneous that looks like this, but then we have our transaction control language, which will be your begin trans, your commits, your rollbacks. We have our data control language, which is going to be those grants and revokes that we talked about with users and logins. We have our data modification language. This is going to be what most of us are going to be used, our IUDs, our inserts, update, deletes. And then we have our data definition language, which we're going to also use quite frequently. And that's where we add and we change our objects within our SQL Server environment. We have our implicit transactions, which are tied to our batches, and then we can have our explicit transactions, where we can identify our begin tran, our commit, our rollback. We can also have named transactions within SQL Server. So if we have a transaction, we can say begin transaction Dan's crazy query, or Dan's really poorly written query, and he's going to get called at 3 a.m. So we can do that as well. How a query is processed within SQL Server, we write our queries like this. We select, we do our tops, our distincts, our froms, all the way down to our order bys here. SQL Server processes it like this. It reads it, it goes in the from, and then the on, our join, our where, and it looks at the group by all the way up, with the top being the last. So it's just something to keep in mind. This is the order of operations, I guess you should say, how SQL Server reads the data that we write. When we're doing query analysis, we have a couple items we can look at. We can look at our estimated execution plan. We can look at our actual execution plan, and we have our statistics statements. And the most often ones I use here are going to be our, my statistic, my statistics IO on, my set statistics time on. Those are the two most frequent I will use out there when I'm troubleshooting a query. The others, you can set show plan on, show plan text, and set statistics XML. I believe show plan text is being deprecated, so I wouldn't if you're just getting into this, I wouldn't start utilizing that. I would start utilizing set show plan, but we'll look at another way we can execute and show our show plans. Well, here we go. Let's look at that real quick. So I have a real simple query out here on my server. Real simple query. I mean, we're not getting into anything advanced. So up at the top here, we talked about We talked about estimated, actual, and estimated and actual. So here you're going to see that we have our estimated, and let me go back, let me zoom back in for us here. I'm zooming in wicked far. All right, we have our estimated, and it has that little blurb, there. Sorry about the squares, folks. And then we have our actual, which is right there. And then there's some new items that they add in SQL 2016. We have our live, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, which will show some really cool information when you're running a query. But let's look at these two first. Let's look at our estimated, and let's look at our actual. So we're going to run this real simple query here. We're going to execute this. Click that. And what this has done is when we click on the estimated execution plan, it provides us an estimate of what's going on with our query, and that is really annoying. It's the sorry about that flicker, folks. That is really bad. That may have been introduced with the latest SSMS. That's a new issue. So that's interesting. But here you can see with our estimated, if we look over here with respect to, let me see if I can get that on the screen a little bit better here. Okay. So if we look, we have our estimated execution plan. And here you're going to see that we only have an estimated number of rows. So it's saying, I estimate for this query, I'm going to pull back 53 rows. Now, if we go over here and we do our actual execution plan, we click on that. And here you can see a little bit of a different behavior. Now it's highlighted, right? So we have our actual estimation plan highlighted. We're going to hit execute. Now, when we get our execution plan back, let's drag this over a bit here. Now, when we look at our query plan, we can see that we have an estimated number of rows, but we also have the actual number of rows. And this is important when troubleshooting. If these are off by a significant number, it can mean many different things. It could mean your queries needs to be rewritten. It could mean it's doing an improper join of some sort. But it could mean you have weird functions going on under the scenes. But usually the first thing I do as a DBA when I see a huge skew there is I go out and I look at my statistics. Are they up to date? Are they fresh? So this provides us with a wealth of information there. Now, if we go here and we set our statistics IO time on, and I am getting some real bad lag. If I set statistics IO on, and I set statistics time on, and we run this, we're going to, and leave the actual execution plan. We can see here we have our actual execution plan, but now if we go to our messages, now we can see we got some different information here. This is going to show us our logical reads, our physical reads, how many scans we did of the table, and that our advanced T-SQL class and our intro to T-SQL goes into a lot more detail as to how to interpret these and what these mean and how you may need to rewrite your queries. But basically, you want to see as many logical reads as you can and as few scans as you can. That's going to return your data. It's not always possible to get all logical reads and the perfect scan count, but the lower the better. And you'll also see over to the right here, you'll see if it's doing read aheads, where it's going out to disk ahead of time and pulling information back ahead of time for you. So really, really cool stuff there. So that's why I would use estimated, actual and my set statistics IO time. Another thing I didn't mention with respect to the actual versus estimated is if I have a query that's running for 4 hours and I want to just see my query plan, running the actual estimation plan may not benefit you. You may want to look at your estimated query plan first to see if anything flushes out. Are you doing a hash join? Are you doing a nested loop that you're not expecting? Look at that sort of information up front before you run the actual. See if there's any low-hanging fruit that you can knock out before you start waiting the 4 hours for that to return. Inside SQL Server 2016, this is really cool. You have this compare show plan. You have the ability to view 2 execution plans side by side. Essentially what you do is you execute the first query, you save off your execution plan, you make your adjustments, add a missing index, update your stats, rewrite your query, and then you can execute your query again and save your execution plan, and then you can compare them and bring them side by side and see if anything's changed. We have the new query, we have the data store. This, from a DBA perspective, this was another exciting feature that was added. It's one of those items that you get excited about, because if you don't have the money to purchase a third-party vendor, say for example, or then you have to go back in and you have to look at the queries and look at DM exec, and you have to look at the query plans if you have to pull them from the cache. Not difficult to do, right? However, what that doesn't provide us is a historical representation of what happened within our SQL Server instance. If we restarted SQL Server, or if the query plan got flushed for some reason, or you needed to flush the query plan, that information's missing. Well, we now have this data store, this query data store, that allows us to track this information. So it allows us to easily find and fix regression, helps us pinpoint the most expensive queries, minimizes our SQL upgrade risk, and it helps us analyze our workloads. We can look at regress queries, overall resource consumption, top resource consuming queries, and track queries. And then we also have Activity Monitor. If you're new to SQL Server and or you just want to look at something real quick, I still use Activity Monitor. You can use Activity Monitor to look at your processor, your waiting tasks. Here you can look at your active expensive queries. So it gives you a real quick breakdown of what's going on in your environment without needing to go pull your SQL scripts. If you put your SQL scripts in something like snippets, they're not that hard to get to, but if you just want a graphical representation to show somebody, Activity Monitor is great for that. Let's pop over to our server real quick. And I want to just show you real quick. So last thing we spoke of was Activity Monitor. So within your SQL Server Management Studio, and we're not going to go in too much, right here up at the top, hiding, is this little graphical interface. And that right there, if you click on it, it's going to pop up your Activity Monitor. I use Activity Monitor for a couple things. To look at my processors, but to look at my recent expensive queries. And I can click on that. And this is the most expensive query. There's also a dangerous thing you can do in here. If I if I wanted to, you can actually, well, I'm not seeing that. So let's talk about that a little bit later. Yes, Lita, Activity Monitor, if you don't have your scripts handy, or SP lock, or SP Who2 is active, or any of those that, that's out in the market, it's a great way to find blocking. It's a real quick and easy way, right? I mean, if you don't have a lot of DBAs on staff, or you're a developer and you're DBA by de facto, it's a great way to look at things. I wanted to show you how easy it was to turn on the query store. So here I have my worldwide importers database. Let's right mouse click on that. We're going to hit properties, and we're going to go down here, and you can let me reduce this and blow this up. But here you can see we have our general, but down at the bottom now we have query store as an item, as a property of our database. Here we can go in and we can say if it wasn't active, this would be set to off, but it's right now I have it set to read write. I have it to flush my data every 15 minutes. I have collection interval, and here you can see which the data is flushed and then it's persisted to disk so we can look at it later. I set my max size for my query store retention to 500 meg. So you can set that all up here. That's how easy it is to turn it on. Here you can do a purge of your data store if it's getting too big. Like for example, if it grows beyond the resources you've allocated, you may see that this is in a read-only state, which means it's no longer collecting stats, and that usually means you've outgrown the resources you've allocated. But now what we can do, now that that's been turned on, and I've run this a couple times, so I'm hoping it's captured the information, we can go down here to management, and we can go to our all right, well, we may need to, oh geez, I'm being a noob. I apologize. So we can go here and we can go to our query store. I have done that 5 times today. I apologize for that. And you can see here that we have our regress queries, our overall resource, but we can click on this, and if we had any regress queries, they would show up in this graph here. We could say, let's look at our top resuming queries. So here you can see I've run these queries several times, and you can choose your top resource, your resource consumers during the last hour for the worldwide importers database. I can look at execution count, logical reads, logical writes. It does, so Salida, it does start with 2016. I have, and you know what? Send me an email, please, because let me do a proof of concept. If anybody's on here, I have heard it may work with 2014, but below that, there are no guarantees, unfortunately. I recommend Query Store a lot when we're doing data migrations from an earlier version of SQL Server to 2016. And what I'll do is I'll leave the database in the older compatibility mode of, let's say, 2008, and then run my queries, and then upgrade to compatibility mode to 2016 and look for regress queries that way. But unfortunately, I've heard it may work in 2014, but it's definitely a 2016 feature, unfortunately. It would be nice that they would port it back to 2016. All right, so let's head back to our slide deck. And okay, so real quickly, this is going to be very, very high level. We're not going to dig into high availability and disaster recovery basics or details. There's just a ton of information. We do have an on-demand course for that. If you want to get into the details, there's a lot of information in there, and there's some great labs that you walk through to set all these items up here that we're discussing. So really, I would like this slide, and I probably want to tweak this for future, and I keep telling it, but high availability and disaster recovery basics and data movement. Because a lot of times when I talk with folks, they're like, well, log shipping and replication, those aren't really high availability features, but I would argue that they are for disaster recovery because I can use log shipping and replication to easily move my data to some sort of co-located data center if database mirroring availability groups or clustering isn't available to me. So within the first thing we'll talk about is log shipping, and basically what log shipping does is it takes our primary database and sends a T-log backup over to one or more secondary database servers. Love that option, that you can send it to more than one secondary database server. You have an optional monitor server that keeps the history status. I usually just look at it's rare I set up a monitor database. I usually like to just either look at my primary database server, secondary database server for the information, the history. And log shipping consists of 3 steps. You back up your transaction log at the primary server. You copy the transaction log over to our secondary store and basically restore the log back up on the secondary server, and log shipping is up and running. Now there's a graphical interface on the front end that will help you through this and walk you through setting up log shipping, so you can easily set up a log shipping environment and get it up and running relatively quickly with no downtime whatsoever. The only impact on your primary instance really is the database backup itself. We have replication. Replication is the copying and disputing of data of objects from one database to another. Don't run from database replication if you're new to SQL Server. If you've been around SQL Server for a long time and you're like me, it has receded my hairline probably 4 or 5 inches over the years, especially if you use merge replication, but it's a great technology that's provided out of the box. We have 3 types of replication. We have transactional, merge, and snapshot that we're showing here on the slide. Transactional replication is essentially a near real-time flow of your data from your your publisher database over here to your subscriber database. Think of it as I'm publishing magazines and you're subscribing to it. You can put filters on the data you're sending down. There's not a ton of functionality if you need to do application type or data type modifications on your, let's say, the subscriber. Something you may want to look at and we don't discuss here is Service Broker. But transactional replication is a real easy way to get your data flowing near real time over to a subscriber or a secondary database. We have database mirroring. Database mirroring is deprecated. It is still in 2016 though. I would hazard to guess it's going to be gone in 2018 if 2018 does hit the market, if they're keeping up with their cadence. But database mirroring is deprecated. It is going away. It is there. However, and somebody brought it up earlier, with the release of Service Pack 1, they've increased how they've allowed us to do more with availability groups in Standard Edition. So rather than having one database inside an availability group, we can now have multiple. And that, I believe, is going to be the replacement for database mirroring. Just know it's still there. You have 2 copies of your database. You have your principal and your mirror. The mirror is a redo of every delete, update, or insert in your primary, and there's a T-log stream that's directly to our MirrorDB for the redo, and that T-log stream is compressed. So it is compressed moving over the wire. So there is some slight delay, but it's really efficient. Database mirroring was my end-all be-all back in the day when I had clustering with mirroring. I could provide a highly available environment. You have 3 operating modes. You have synchronous, asynchronous, and then you have a witness server that provides us with automatic failover. With synchronous, transaction committed on both DBs synchronously, so your data is considered hardened essentially. With asynchronous, you have transactions commit on the principal without waiting for the mirror, so there could be some slight data loss with asynchronous mode. But if you're having performance issues and you're not worried about losing a little bit of data on your mirror side, then asynchronous may be something you could implement. Always on, introduced in 2012. It's gone through several iterations. I need to put some spaces in there. Always on, we were introduced with the first always on. Really, that's where we were provided availability groups, which provides us with, instead of server level protection, it provides us with database level protection. We can have multiple secondaries with availability groups, up to 8, I believe it is now, with 3 that can be failed over to automatically. We have our failover cluster instances. They're still there. They're going to be around. Failover cluster instances are still used heavily in the market. I just set some up recently. Failover cluster instances with availability groups, it's a costly solution, but you're providing a lot of uptime there. We mentioned Windows Core support here. I see an adoption rate of this, not as much as I think Microsoft would like to see, but it can reduce your OS patching by 50 to 60%, which reduces your downtime. They enhanced in 2014 and 2016 the reindexing of large objects. Also, it's important to point out that always-on availability groups in 2016, the redo of those, they perform much better than 2014. So if you're looking at availability groups and you're looking at installing a new instance of SQL Server, I recommend going straight to 2016 if you can, based on just the improvements on the redo factor on the back end. It really helps, especially if you're doing maintenance and you have really large databases. So you have a here they walk through. You know what? I'll allow you guys to go through this slide on your own, but basically it's showing the different types of HR type and DR solutions that you can have and what level of availability you provide. One being, provide great high availability with the lowest cost. The third one providing more uptime but at a greater cost. Availability groups, we talked a lot about this. You can have up to a total 8 secondaries with 2016. You can have now 3 synchronous secondaries. It has built-in compression. I love this. Now this was available in database mirroring, but auto page repair. If there is corruption detected within your database, the availability group will pull from one of the readable secondaries, and it'll automatically repair that page on the write server. Really flexible failover policy now. They've added some functionality there that allows us to reduce the false positives from a failover standpoint. It's integrated. They give us great dashboards and wizards. We'll look at a little bit of that here. We have the active secondaries, which can be readable for our clients, so we can offload workloads there. We can send people to our secondary databases, so when we're loading the primary, they're not conflicting with each other. We can back up on our secondaries, improving our performance and offloading work. Look, having a secondary server sitting out there doing nothing, it goes back to like that balancing the workload. It's not cost effective. Now we can say, hey, we want these availability groups for high availability. Well, we don't really want to spend the money on that second server. Well, but I can offload these backups. I can offload the folks to make the readable secondaries, and I can provide more uptime for our read-only queries. Some considerations, all of our databases need to be failed over. It's a single unit of failover. So if all of your databases are contained within an availability group, all those are going to swing and fail over at the same time. the databases on an instance that aren't involved in an availability group will stay on there. So if that server goes down, they go down. If you have any jobs or objects outside the database that point to these, you'll need to customize them. You'll need to put monitoring in place that'll say, that'll check for, this is the primary availability group. I need to do these updates and these data updates here. So you need to keep that in mind. We've talked about AlwaysOn failover cluster. It provides us availability at the instance level. We can also provide disaster recovery at an instance level. So with 2012 and 2014, we can have we have multi subnet report native. So now you can have a failover cluster instance. It's not easy to set up, but you can do it over multi subnets. A lot of information on this slide. What's important is if you have, let's say, a failover cluster instance, you can now have your TempDB local to the instance that it resides on. So if you have node 1 and node 2, you can have TempDB. You can have local disk allocated to your TempDB. You could put some really fast internal SSDs, and you could speed up your TempDB performance that way at a less costly solution. And it's an important note that the TempDB local paths need to be available to SQL Server on all the nodes, so they need to be set up the same way. This talks about the flexibility. In 2008, basically, it did a select add server name to check for the health check. If that failed for any reason, we would have issues. Now we have the SP server diagnostics. This is configurable, and it allows us to eliminate some of the false failovers. And it has improved logging for more valuable diagnostics. Maintenance plans, just want to look, scripts are the best way to go when it comes to maintenance plans, and there's some great scripts out there that are free. You know, Minuware, Ola Hellengren scripts, great scripts out there, very flexible, allow you to do a lot of powerful stuff with them when it comes to maintenance. But don't be afraid if you're new or if you just want to, set up a maintenance plan within SQL Server itself. Use SSMS to configure it and set it up. I would much rather see someone have a maintenance plan and use the graphical user interface than not have a maintenance plan on their servers. You can integrate your backups, index statistics, and all of your database integrity all within one nice flow, and you can send out messages via that. So my basic takeaway from this slide for you is use maintenance plans the best you see fit for your environment. Scripting's the way to go, but I would much rather see you use this than have nothing at all. Well, let's go over here real quick. So over on my instance here, and I wanted to show you this, and that slide deck, we talked about a couple things there. Let's close this down. We talked about availability groups, failover cluster indexes, failover cluster instances, and the Windows Server failover cluster. If for some reason you were and we're not going to get into the details, but if you were managing a failover cluster instance or availability groups, there's a couple components you can look at. You can look at your failover cluster manager, and this provides you information, and I have some failures here, but this provides you information about your roles. And here you can see I have a basic availability group. I know that's my basic because I called it by the name. And then I set up, just for this takeover, a real basic availability group. And you can see it's up and running. You can see here within here the nodes, the servers that are taking place in this cluster. I have SQL HA node 1 and 2, and then it gives other information about our networks and our cluster events. And you can see here I have some errors. I had a server crash earlier today, so I have some error messages in there. But this is one of the places if you had issues you would look and you would start digging into it. And this is why I say an experienced team, because you're gonna wanna dig into those objects. Now, from an availability group perspective, you have here a new folder, and I set up an availability group, but what I wanted to show real quick is the dashboard. So here you would drill down, you would go to AlwaysOn availability groups, you would drill in, and then you would select the availability groups folder, and there you would see all the availability groups you have installed on your server, or I'm sorry, configured within your SQL Server instance. And it is lagging. All right, so we will come back to that. Hopefully when we come back, it is back up and running. So earlier on, I talked about baseline and monitoring, and I like to, I think next time we do this, we're probably going to ask how many folks have the time or provided the time to set up a baseline. I came from the full-time environment and I worked, and every time we set up a new server, I requested that we have time to set up baselines. And probably many of you know the answer that I received. You know, in most cases, setting up a baseline, I was not provided the time to do it or the resources. And if I did give the time, they blamed me and said that would push QA out 8 weeks. So a lot of times baselines took a back seat. But what we need to know, what we should take away with respect to baselines, it lets us understand how our system functions normally. So we have a couple tools. We have Performance Monitor, which we talked about and we looked at. We have Resource Monitor, which is in Windows. We have our SQL Traces profiler, and the profiler is still there in 2016. Extended events came out in 2008 and up, so we like to use extended events when troubleshooting issues. I still use Profiler. I still use Profiler for my replays on my lower servers, but it's out there. We were provided with DMVs in 2005 and up. We have Activity Monitor, which has been around forever, and we have the Performance Management Data Warehouse. All tools that we could utilize that are free to us to get our baselines. Performance Monitor, we looked at it earlier. It aggregates our hardware and software counters. It's exposed to our Windows API. It's limited if we use it by itself, right? If we don't have any SQL queries or if we don't combine it with any of our, let's say, profiler information, it just tells us our hardware is doing bad. But why is our hardware doing bad? Is it because we have a bad query? Is it because we don't have enough CPUs? It provides us a little bit of information, but it provides us baseline information and information that we need to know and dig in later. You can save it to folders as binaries, binary folders. You can convert the output to a CSV by typing that command there. It used to save as CSV. They took that away. And then you can put it into Excel or import it into SQL Server to aggregate your data, run some great reports, become real good friends by your but it's time consuming. Can you recommend it? Salita, yes. Yes. We'll definitely talk about that. Maybe not here, but we can talk about that. But you can export a perfmon template, and then you can move that template from server to server. You could, for example, automate that via PowerShell. And there's a link inside the slide deck to Colleen Morrow's example of how to do this via PowerShell. So it may be something that you could use, or there may be some other tools that we could recommend to push out Performance Monitor. Once again, though, you got to gather those stats, pull those stats in, and be able to interpret them. We looked at Performance Monitor earlier, so we'll skip that demo here. Management Data Warehouse. I don't know how many people use this. I use this when I'm not provided any tools whatsoever and I just don't have the time. It is a bit clunky to set up, but basically what it's going to give us is it's going to put together a nice set of reports in a single location for all the servers that we define we need it to collect. It tracks our disk usage, our query activity, our server activity, our query statistics history, the built-in reports. It'll show us our query statistics history, our server activity history, and you can see over here some basic reports. Unfortunately, my server that had management data warehouse did not come up clean last with my server clash, so I can't show you a physical version of this running, but this is an example of what some of the reports will look like. You have your two collection modes. I like to use the non-cache where it sets up several environments and it'll load in the counters over time versus cache where it's constantly updating the tables behind the scenes here. And also we recommend that you set up a management data warehouse instance to collect all these stats. And this is a better view of the reports that it throws out. This is free. This is built in within SQL Server. It is a bit clunky to set up in the beginning, and if you want to remove it, it's not going to remove. And in 2016, I could not, without doing the workaround, and Microsoft has a workaround provided, I could not get it to remove all the components that it installs. So it does leave behind some stored procedures and some SQL agent jobs that you'll have to clean up manually. There's several Connect items out there that are asking them to improve the rollback experience, but they haven't quite fixed it yet. Activity Monitor we discussed, great tool to look at things. We discussed earlier, it's great to look at locking. It's a quick hit view of everything that's going on within your environment. Your data file I/O, your resource weights, my most recent expensive queries. It's just something there that you can utilize. Now, from a baselining perspective, this isn't going to give you any baseline information, but it's going to tell you what's going on at that point in time. We looked at Activity Monitor. Yes, we did. So I actually looked at some of those demos ahead of time, and we'll go back to the server. Some free third-party tools to look at Disk I/O. Crystal Disk Mark is free, SQL I/O is free, and CPU-Z is free. I usually, if I think there's an I/O problem when a database server is set up and handed over to me, and I actually use either SQL I/O or Crystal Disk Mark in the beginning to determine whether or not I'm getting the throughput that I'm expecting. If I'm expecting 500 megabytes a second throughput, I should see that in Crystal Disk Mark. And you need to get with your SAN engineers to get, your network configuration, your SAN configuration, how many spindles you have, the type of disks, and then you can run, based on that information, you can run your Crystal Disk Mark and go, I'm only seeing 100 megabytes per second coming through, and you're telling me I should be seeing 750. It's a great way to start that conversation that we may have some SAN issues. CPU-Z, I like using that. I don't normally use it unless I'm seeing issues, but I like to use it to show the point that when we set up a SQL Server instance, I like to have the power mode set to high performance versus balanced. That way I'm getting full usage of my SQL Server environment. Some third-party tools that are costly, or at least not free, Redgate, Idera, SQL Sentry, SolarWinds, who has been since bought out, and Quest, which I think has been bought out as well. My two favorites on there, honestly, if I have a SQL Server environment only and I'm not Resource Monitor, much forgotten, yes. Yes. But preferably I like using SQL Sentry if I have just a sole SQL Server environment and that's all I'm monitoring. You can get some good package deals on there, but it is a per server basis. A lot of great information comes out of SQL Sentry. SolarWinds, if I have DB2, if I have Oracle, if I have SQL Server in my environment, I might look at something like SolarWinds because it provides a single dashboard with a lot of the same information SQL Sentry provides us. So I may look at that. Both of those can be costly. SolarWinds is a little bit more costly than SQL Sentry, but it's because of what you're getting, because of what it does. So both very good tools. IDEA and Redgate, both good tools. I personally have seen SQL Sentry and SolarWinds move forward. IDEA is making a good push, and Redgate's making a good push recently, so I can't really speak on their recent releases. You know, do a postmortem. If something goes wrong, having these baselines makes it a lot easier to be able to go, nope, this is how it's been running for the last month, or no, you're correct, we have an issue and we have something to look at. Extended events. In SQL Server 2008, they provided us with extended events, and basically it's a extended events is one of those lightweight monitoring tools. However, back in 2008, there wasn't a huge adoption rate. And why wasn't it? Because you had to write SQL for everything that you needed to do. So anytime you had to configure, you wanted to configure, set up an extended events session to track something, it was a daunting task. A great guy out there, Jonathan Caius, a friend of mine, he wrote a good front end if you're using SQL Server 2008. Yes. Nadia, I will cover that here in a second, but you know, so he wrote a front end, a GUI that if you are using 2008, you can plug in there. It's a lightweight, highly configurable performance monitoring system that allows us to track the events that are going on within our environment. Now, Microsoft is making a push for extended events, and they're saying they're getting rid of Profiler. There's still some things that I would like to see them put in extended events. For example, if I'm tracking my performance, I would love for them to allow me to take that extended events, either dump it out as a nice XML or something along those lines, and be able to put it in distributed replay coordinator. I would really like to see that happen. However, I still use Profile to do that because it's just much easier to set up and configure and get running. So let's look at, let's just take a quick look. There's a lot of information on extended events and a lot to learn with extended events, but one of the things I wanted to show you is, and we are still in a bad state. So folks, I just updated to the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio. And I'm having these issues, so I'm not sure what version is, but if you're asked for an update, you may want to hold off at this point in time because it looks like it could be my machine though. Looks like there's some minor issues though, because I didn't see these when I was walking through stuff last night. All right, so extended events. So we're going to go here and we're going to go to management. And here you're going to see extended events. A couple things I want to show here. With extended events, we have a couple things that are, well, we have a couple things that you'll see. You'll see here, you'll see your always-on health checks, and you'll see your system health. If you see these on, the always-on is enabled when you enable always-on databases. So don't turn that off. It gives you a lot of great information. Also, the system health. The system health is going to give you a lot of information about locking and deadlocks and information that if you haven't looked at these extended event sessions yet, you may want to dig into them because it'll show you if you've met your SQL Server high or low watermark. So there's a lot of information in there by default coming out of the box. One of the things I wanted to show with extended events though is I want to show, so we want to do a new session and we won't, so we're going to call it Takeover. And one of the things I wanted to show here is in the templates, there was not a lot of templates available when this first came out. But right here, this was a huge win in the previous to this SSMS release. We have profiler equivalents. We don't have to now go in extended events and plug in all the information to look like profiler. So this is them trying to wean us off a profiler. So here we could do so for example, we like using the profiler tuning because we want to, or T-SQL replay. We want to do that. We wanted to look at, we could just select that template, hit OK. And now we have, if we start our session, now we have a session that is going to look like our profiler trace that we used to do. Very, very easy to do now. And here's the other great thing is right now we can script out our extended event sessions, and we can port this over to another server if we wanted to. So really, really cool. They've made some huge improvements in the standalone version of SSMS 2016. A lot of them some of them revolving around extended events and making it better. So another reason why I recommend using this. Using this, let me fill that. Using the SQL Server Management Studio Edition. I apologize for that. All right, let me move this out of the way here. See where we are at. All right, and we are coming up at the top of the hour, but let's start here and see. So basic troubleshooting in DMVs. So we have our SQL Server error logs. We have our session-related DMVs and some powerful DMVs. So we have tools available to us. So the tools I like to use are the Windows Event Viewer, our SQL Server error logs, Activity Monitor, and T-SQL scripts. We've gone over what SQL Server, the Activity Monitor does for us. Our SQL Server error logs provide us a ton of information. Dig in there and look at those. We can read those through the XP read, but Activity Monitor provides us information that's really helpful. SP-Who2 is great. There's a great free SP-Who2 is active out there by a blogger in the community that I would recommend putting on all your servers. It is tremendously helpful when troubleshooting issues, especially locking issues. So we have, within 2005, we have the DMVs that we use. The most often, DMVs I use most often are probably my DM exec sessions, my DM exec requests, my DM exec query plans, my DM tran locks, and my DM IO virtual stats, and my DM OS wait stats. Those are the ones when I'm troubleshooting issues I look at most commonly. For looking at the maintenance of my databases, if I think my databases are out of sync or my stats are bad, then I will start looking at my physical index stats and my DB index usage stats. A lot of DMVs here that you should dig into. And those we go into a lot more detail in our fundamentals online class. Don't forget the DAC. We have one DAC available. It's a dedicated server connection. You can connect through your SQL command.exe-a-d.master. This is a dedicated connection to you. So if you're out of sessions on your server, this is kind of a backdoor way in to try and get your instance back and up and running and kill those processes that may be consuming the connections that won't let you in. So that covers the fundamentals. We went over a ton of information, a ton. This is actually a we condensed, it's I guess about a 14-hour course, 16-hour course with labs and slide decks and somebody going through the details of these fundamentals, and we condensed it into this takeover so you could get a feel, a baseline, a foundation of what you need to look at if you're new to this environment, if you're intermediate. You know, there's some information. And I know a lot of you senior folks stuck around, and I do appreciate it. I love talking with y'all and sharing ideas back and forth. And if you have any questions, please email me. And it looks like, why, Liz, Liz, are you still there? Oh, or it looks like I lost the ability. So to type in the box, and I apologize, folks, it is SP who to is active. It's actually by a guy named Adam Mechanic. Great tool. You know, it's, thank you, Harry. It's so David, how much control do you have in environment? Do you have a lot of security folks? Thank you, SP who is active. So if you have like, I couldn't get it in one environment because security wouldn't allow me to install it, and I fought, and they still would not allow me to put it there. But SP who is active, as Crewbot corrected me, thank you, is a wonderful free script out there provided to us. Nadia, you asked, can you point out some advantages and disadvantages for third-party tools? Absolutely. Advantages to third-party tools, and let me stop here. Oops, oh no. All right, I am sorry, folks. I am running out of disk space, so I'll find it here in a second. I don't want to impact you guys. So the advantages to third-party tools are this. They allow us to do our daily tasks. They allow us to do releases. They allow us to do performance and monitoring, and they allow us, most importantly, to be proactive versus reactive. Now, that being said, they're costly and they're expensive. And if you don't have a lot of money in your budget, it's hard to get approval for it. Another huge advantage is they have the time and resources to write the code. They have the resources to write the code and test it and keep up with the recent versions of SQL Server. Because let's face it, Microsoft changes DMVs on us. They change this information behind the scenes. So we have to have the resources on staff to be able to rewrite that code ourselves. So the advantages for writing our own is it's less costly. We have full maintenance over it. However, the disadvantages is the time it takes us to write that. So hopefully that answers your question. The biggest disadvantages is being able to keep up with the changes of SQL Server 2016 if you're a small, or any SQL Server release, if you have a really small staff. If you have a large staff of DBAs and they have the bandwidth, then by all, do your own internal monitoring and reports, because that will save you money in the long run.
Hey Dan, I know we're running out of time here, but you may want to go ahead and stop recording, so that that might be eating up your disk space right now.
Yeah, no, that's what I was trying to find, and I didn't want to impact the folks. I couldn't find the stop recording, and that's, by the way, recorded.
Yeah, so I'll mention that real quickly because I know you got to wrap up. You have to go back to your customer. But folks, thank you first of all for attending this 3-hour session. I'm sure Dan's mentioned it a couple times, but this session has